Imagine this. You're 8 months pregnant, hosting the ultimate family barbecue at your luxurious estate, smiling through the exhaustion as guests arrive in fancy cars. Everything seems perfect until your husband's stunning young business partner shows up, flashing a radiant smile and sharing inside jokes with him that make your stomach twist. Then, in a moment that changes everything, she slaps you right across the face in front of everyone and your millionaire husband. He desperately tries to hide the video evidence that's about to leak and blow their secret affair wide open. But wait, this isn't just a simple cheating scandal. What if I told you it's a web of corporate espionage, fake reconciliations, hospital emergencies, and a brutal custody battle where the mistress plots to steal your baby, twists upon twists that will leave you gasping hidden emails, anonymous tips, and a shocking revelation that turns the villain into a pawn in a bigger game. From heartbreak to empowerment, Sarah's journey is a roller coaster you won't want to miss. Stick around to hear the full, jaw-dropping story. Trust me, the ending will have you cheering for justice. If you're already hooked, smash that like button if you love revenge tales. Drop a comment below with who you think the real villain is. Share this with a friend who needs some drama in their day. And hit subscribe with notifications on so you never miss another epic story like this. Let's dive in. Sarah Mitchell stood in her marble-floored kitchen, arranging organic vegetables on silver platters for the family barbecue. At 38 weeks pregnant, every movement required careful planning. Her swollen feet ached in designer flats, but she smiled through the discomfort. Today had to be perfect. The Mitchell estate sprawled across 5 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside. David had bought it 3 years ago when his tech startup went public, making him worth $47 million overnight. Sarah remembered feeling like Cinderella moving into this modern castle, complete with a pool house, tennis court, and gardens that required a full-time landscaping crew. Now, preparing for their monthly family gathering, Sarah wondered when the fairy tale had started feeling like a burden. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A text from her best friend Maria Santos read simply, "How are you holding up?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. How could she explain the growing distance she felt from David? The way he spent increasingly long hours at the office, claiming his new AI venture required constant attention? The suspicious phone calls that stopped abruptly when she entered the room instead. She typed back, "Everything's fine, just tired from party prep." The lie came easily now. Sarah had become an expert at maintaining the illusion of marital bliss, especially when David's business associates and their wives descended on their home like perfectly groomed vultures, evaluating every detail of their domestic paradise. David emerged from his home office, adjusting his Rolex Submariner. Even at 42, he possessed the lean build and sharp jawline that had first attracted Sarah at a marketing conference 8 years ago. She'd been climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious advertising firm then, proud of her independence and 6-figure salary. Those days felt like someone else's life. "The Andersons will be here in 20 minutes, David announced, barely glancing at Sarah's carefully prepared spread. "Jessica is coming too. She's been instrumental in securing our overseas partnerships." Sarah's stomach clenched at the mention of Jessica Chen. David's 29-year-old business associate had joined his company 6 months ago, bringing impressive credentials from Stanford Business School and previous stints at major tech firms. She was everything Sarah used to be: ambitious, sharp, unmarked by the physical and emotional toll of pregnancy and domesticity. "I didn't realize Jessica was family," Sarah said quietly, continuing to arrange appetizers. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's practically family now. The amount of time we spend together working on the Singapore expansion makes her feel like part of the team." The casual way he mentioned spending time with Jessica sent another wave of unease through Sarah's chest. She'd learned to recognize the subtle signs of David's irritation when questioned. His voice took on a clipped, professional tone, as if she were a subordinate employee rather than his wife of 6 years. The first guests arrived in a parade of luxury vehicles. Sarah transformed into her role as the perfect hostess, greeting everyone with practiced warmth while David held court near the outdoor bar, regaling his colleagues with stories of their latest business triumphs. Jessica arrived fashionably late in a sleek black Tesla Model S. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the younger woman emerged wearing a form-fitting coral dress that emphasized her slim figure. Her long black hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her smile was radiant as she greeted David with what seemed like an overly familiar hug. Sarah smoothed her own maternity dress, suddenly feeling frumpy and invisible. The beautiful sage green fabric that had made her feel elegant that morning now seemed to emphasize her swollen body and tired eyes. Sarah called Margaret Anderson from the patio. "This salmon is incredible. You must give me the recipe." Sarah forced another smile and joined the group outside, carrying a tray of fresh fruit. As she approached, she heard Jessica's melodic laugh rising above the conversation. The young woman was describing a recent business trip to San Francisco, her animated gestures capturing everyone's attention. "David and I worked until 3 in the morning preparing for the client presentation," Jessica said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "We were practically sleeping at the office those last few days before the trip." Sarah's grip tightened on the serving tray. David had told her those late nights were solo strategy sessions. The detail about them working together so closely felt like a small betrayal, though she couldn't articulate why. David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with unusual intensity. Sarah noticed how quickly he angled the screen away from view, a habit that had become increasingly common. When she'd mentioned it weeks earlier, he'd dismissed her concerns as pregnancy hormones making her paranoid. "Excuse me for a moment," David said, stepping away from the group. "Important call from our Tokyo partners." Jessica's eyes followed him as he disappeared into the house. Sarah noticed the way the younger woman's expression softened when she looked at David, a tenderness that seemed inappropriate for a business relationship. "Jessica, tell us about your background," urged Patricia Hoffman, the wife of David's primary investor. "It's so refreshing to see successful young women in tech." Jessica launched into her professional biography with confidence. Stanford MBA, previous roles at Google and Amazon, fluency in 3 languages, and an impressive track record of securing international partnerships. Each accomplishment felt like a sharp reminder of what Sarah had given up when she'd agreed to focus on their family. Sarah remembered her own career highlights, leading a multi-million-dollar campaign for a major automotive company, winning industry awards, mentoring junior executives. Those achievements felt ancient now, buried under years of domestic responsibilities and the identity erosion that came with being known primarily as someone's wife. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pool deck as Sarah retreated to the kitchen to prepare dessert. Through the window, she could see Jessica had moved closer to David, who had returned from his mysterious phone call. They stood slightly apart from the other guests, their conversation appearing intense and private. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she arranged fresh berries on individual tarts. The pregnancy had made her emotional, but this felt different. This felt like intuition, screaming warnings she didn't want to hear. Maria Santos appeared in the kitchen doorway, her lawyer instincts apparently detecting Sarah's distress. At 42, Maria maintained the sharp intelligence and fierce loyalty that had made her Sarah's closest friend since college. She'd built a successful family law practice specializing in high-asset divorces, though Sarah had never imagined that expertise might become personally relevant. "You look exhausted," Maria observed, accepting a glass of sparkling water. "Are you getting enough rest?" Sarah wanted to confide her growing concerns about David's behavior. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he seemed to light up around Jessica in a way he hadn't with Sarah in months. Instead, she deflected. "Just 3rd trimester fatigue. The baby's been active at night, making sleep difficult." Maria's expression softened with sympathy, but Sarah caught a flicker of something else in her friend's eyes. Professional concern, perhaps. As a divorce attorney, Maria had developed an instinct for recognizing the early signs of marital dysfunction. "If you ever need to talk about anything," Maria said carefully, "you know I'm here. Sometimes pregnancy can be a stressful time for couples." Before Sarah could respond, David's voice carried in from the patio, raised in what sounded like excitement. She and Maria moved to the window to see him showing something on his phone to the gathered guests. Jessica stood particularly close, her hand resting briefly on his arm as she leaned in to see the screen. "What are they looking at?" Sarah murmured. The group erupted in congratulations and applause. Sarah hurried outside, curiosity overriding her growing discomfort with Jessica's proximity to her husband. "What's the celebration about?" Sarah asked, approaching the circle of guests. David's face was flushed with triumph. "We just got confirmation that the Singapore deal went through. 60 million in funding for our overseas expansion. Jessica's contacts made it possible." The group toasted Jessica's success while Sarah stood on the periphery, feeling strangely excluded from her husband's moment of triumph. She remembered when David used to share his business victories with her first, seeking her advice and celebrating their shared future. Now she learned about major developments at the same time as casual acquaintances. As the sun began to set, guests started departing with effusive thanks and promises to reciprocate the invitation soon. Sarah gathered abandoned plates and glasses, her back aching from hours on her feet. Jessica was among the last to leave, lingering near David's car in conversation that seemed unnecessarily prolonged. Finally alone, Sarah and David began the cleanup process in relative silence. The perfect facade of their afternoon felt exhausting to maintain, and Sarah found herself longing for the authentic intimacy they'd once shared. "Jessica seems very dedicated to the business," Sarah ventured as she loaded the dishwasher. David's response came quickly, almost defensively. "She's brilliant. Her international connections are invaluable for our expansion plans. I'm lucky to have someone so committed on the team." The word committed hit Sarah strangely. It seemed too personal a descriptor for a business relationship, too intimate for professional admiration. "How late did you two actually work those nights she mentioned?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone casual. David's jaw tightened again, the same micro-expression that appeared whenever he felt challenged. "As late as necessary to secure $60 million in funding. I thought you'd be happy about our success instead of questioning my work methods." The conversation was taking a turn Sarah recognized and dreaded. David had perfected the art of making her feel unreasonable for asking normal questions about their life together. He would frame her natural curiosity as jealousy or paranoia, making her doubt her own perceptions. "I am happy about the business success," Sarah said quietly. "I just miss feeling included in your world." "You're included in everything that matters," David replied, but his attention was already shifting to his phone, which had buzzed with another message. He read it quickly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth before he caught himself and schooled his expression back to neutrality. That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her perfect life was built on increasingly unstable ground. The baby kicked strongly against her ribs, as if sensing her anxiety and responding with its own restlessness. She thought about Maria's offer to talk, about the concerned look in her friend's eyes. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid, just as David suggested. But deep in her chest, a cold certainty was taking root. Something fundamental had changed in her marriage, and she was the last to know about it. The clock on her nightstand read 2:47 a.m. when Sarah finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring the first piece of concrete evidence that her instincts had been correct all along. Sarah's prenatal appointment the following Tuesday morning started routinely enough. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her obstetrician for the past 8 months, conducted the usual measurements and listened to the baby's heartbeat with practiced efficiency. But when she pressed the stethoscope to Sarah's chest, her expression grew concerned. "Your heart rate is elevated," Dr. Walsh observed, checking her notes. "Are you experiencing unusual stress or anxiety?" Sarah hesitated. How could she explain the growing sense of unease that had been building for weeks? The way David seemed increasingly distant, the suspicious phone calls, the uncomfortable dynamic she'd witnessed between him and Jessica at the barbecue. "Just the normal third trimester worries," Sarah said finally. "Wondering if we're ready." thinking about the delivery, that sort of thing. Doctor, Walsh made notes in Sarah's chart, her expression still troubled. Your blood pressure is also slightly elevated from your last visit. I want you to monitor stress levels carefully. High blood pressure during pregnancy can lead to complications for both you and the baby. The drive home gave Sarah time to think about the doctor's warning. She'd always prided herself on managing stress well during her corporate career, but something about her current situation felt fundamentally different. The uncertainty was eating at her in ways she couldn't control. David's home office door was closed when she arrived, voices carrying through the solid wood. Sarah could hear him speaking in the animated tone he reserved for important business discussions, punctuated by a familiar feminine laugh that made her stomach clench. Jessica was here again. Sarah stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. The conversation seemed focused on travel arrangements and meeting schedules. Nothing obviously inappropriate. But the easy intimacy in their exchanges felt wrong somehow. Too comfortable for colleagues who'd known each other only 6 months. She knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, a strategy she'd developed for gauging David's reaction to interruption. His expression flickered with something like annoyance before settling into a professional smile. How did the appointment go? He asked, barely glancing up from the financial documents spread across his desk. Jessica sat in the leather chair opposite him, her laptop open and a stack of contracts beside her. She offered Sarah a friendly wave, but there was something calculating in her eyes, as if she were assessing potential threat levels. Everything's fine, Sarah replied, choosing not to mention the doctor's concerns about her stress levels. I'll leave you to your work. As she closed the office door behind her, Sarah heard Jessica's voice drop to a more intimate whisper, though she couldn't make out specific words. The sound sent another wave of unease through her chest. In the kitchen, Sarah began preparing lunch while her mind raced. She thought about Dr. Walsh's warning about stress affecting the baby. The last thing she wanted was to create problems based on unfounded suspicions, but ignoring her instincts felt equally dangerous. Her phone rang, Maria's number appearing on the screen like an answer to unspoken prayers. How are you feeling after yesterday's party? Maria asked without preamble. You seemed tense during the barbecue. Sarah glanced toward David's office, ensuring the door remained closed. Can I ask you something as a friend, not as a lawyer? Of course. If you suspected your spouse was having an affair, what would you look for? What signs should raise red flags? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Sarah wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, Maria spoke carefully. Sudden changes in routine, increased secrecy about work or travel, unexplained expenses, emotional distance, and defensive reactions to normal questions. Why are you asking? Sarah's heart sank as she recognized multiple items from Maria's list in David's recent behavior. Hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to investigate those suspicions discreetly, how would they go about it? Sarah, Maria's voice carried clear concern now. Are we still speaking hypothetically? I don't know. Maybe. I think so. Financial records are often the most revealing, Maria said gently. Credit card statements, hotel bookings, unusual purchases. But honey, I have to ask, are you prepared for what you might find? The question hung in the air as Sarah heard David's office door open. She quickly changed the subject to baby preparations and nursery decorating, maintaining the casual tone while her husband and Jessica emerged into the hallway. I should go, Sarah told Maria. We'll talk soon. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, Jessica close behind him. They both carried the satisfied expression of people who'd accomplished important work together, and Sarah noticed how Jessica's hand brushed David's arm as she passed him to retrieve her purse from the counter. We're going to grab lunch and discuss the Singapore timeline, David announced. Jessica knows a great sushi place downtown. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Sushi? I thought pregnant women were supposed to avoid raw fish, and you usually prefer to eat at home during workdays. We're not eating sushi, David said quickly, his tone sharp with irritation. It's a Japanese restaurant that serves cooked options. We need to work through some complex logistics away from distractions. The implication that his pregnant wife constituted a distraction stung more than Sarah expected. She watched them leave together, noting how naturally they moved as a pair, how Jessica seemed to anticipate David's movements and preferences. Alone in the house, Sarah found herself drawn to David's office. She'd never snooped through his belongings before, had always respected his privacy and trusted his explanations. But Dr. Walsh's warning about stress affecting the baby gave her a new sense of urgency. She needed to know the truth, if only to protect her own health and peace of mind. David's desk was organized with military precision, contracts and financial reports arranged in neat stacks. Sarah looked through the visible papers, finding nothing immediately suspicious. Business correspondence, partnership agreements, and technical specifications for their various projects. His computer was password protected, as expected. But David had always been careless with physical documents, often printing emails and reports to review offline. Sarah opened the desk drawers systematically, looking for anything that might explain her growing unease. In the bottom drawer, wedged behind a stack of old business magazines, she found hotel receipts, the Meridian in downtown Hartford, multiple dates over the past 2 months. The charges were for dinner and drinks, nothing overnight, but David had never mentioned business dinners at that particular location. Sarah photographed the receipts with her phone, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't proof of infidelity, but it was evidence of deception. David had been having undisclosed meetings at an upscale hotel, and he'd chosen not to share that information with his wife. Her search revealed more troubling details. Credit card statements showed charges at expensive jewelry stores, purchases Sarah had never received, flowers delivered to an address she didn't recognize, restaurant bills for two at intimate venues during times when David had claimed to be in solo strategy meetings. The evidence painted a picture of a secret life, a parallel existence that ran alongside their marriage without her knowledge. Sarah felt physically ill as the implications sank in. The stress she'd been experiencing wasn't paranoia or pregnancy hormones. Her instincts had been screaming warnings about real deception. She quickly photographed the most damning documents, then carefully returned everything to its original position. David would be back soon, and she needed time to process what she'd discovered before confronting him. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of anxiety and dawning realization. Sarah tried to focus on mundane tasks like organizing the nursery and responding to emails, but her mind kept returning to the hotel receipts and jewelry store charges. Each piece of evidence felt like another crack in the foundation of her marriage. David returned home at sunset, his mood unusually upbeat. He'd brought takeout from Sarah's favorite Thai restaurant, a gesture that would have felt thoughtful under normal circumstances, but now seemed like guilt-motivated overcompensation. "How was your business lunch?" Sarah asked as they sat down to eat. "Productive. Jessica has some innovative ideas about international market penetration. Her perspective has been invaluable." Sarah studied her husband's face as he spoke about Jessica, noting the way his expression softened when he mentioned her name. There was an enthusiasm there that had been absent from his voice when discussing their own relationship for months. "The baby was very active during my appointment today," Sarah said, changing the subject to test David's level of engagement with their pregnancy. "Dr. Walsh thinks we might have a soccer player on our hands." David nodded absently, his attention already drifting to his phone. "That's nice, honey. Did she mention when you might deliver?" The casual dismissal of their child's development felt like another small betrayal. Sarah remembered when David used to hang on every detail from her appointments, asking questions about the baby's growth and speculating about their future together. Now he seemed to view her pregnancy as background noise to his increasingly complex professional life. That evening, as David worked late in his office again, Sarah sat in the nursery they'd been preparing together. The walls were painted a soft yellow, gender-neutral and calming. The crib waited empty, still needing assembly. Baby clothes hung in neat rows, tiny outfits that represented hope and anticipation for their growing family. But the joy Sarah had expected to feel was overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. She thought about Maria's question, was she prepared for what she might find? The evidence she'd discovered today suggested David was involved in some form of deception, whether emotional or physical infidelity. The full truth remained unclear, but the foundation of trust that had supported their marriage was crumbling beneath her feet. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check your husband's car, driver's side compartment. You deserve to know the truth. A friend." Her heart pounded as she read the message twice, then deleted it immediately. Someone else knew about David's secrets and cared enough to warn her. The anonymous tip felt both terrifying and validating, confirming that her suspicions weren't entirely unfounded. The house was quiet as Sarah made her way to the garage, David still absorbed in his late-night work session. She opened the door to his BMW and felt around the driver's side compartment, her fingers searching for anything unusual. Hidden beneath registration papers and the owner's manual, she found a small jewelry box from Tiffany & Co. Inside lay a delicate diamond necklace, far more expensive and personal than anything David had given her in recent years. The accompanying card was unsigned but bore a message in David's handwriting, "For making everything worthwhile. All my love." Sarah stared at the necklace and card, the final piece of evidence falling into place. This wasn't a business relationship or a professional admiration. David was having an affair, and he was in love with Jessica Chen. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak. She managed to return everything to its hiding place and make it back to the house before the full emotional impact overwhelmed her. In their bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Her marriage was a lie. The man she'd trusted with her heart, her future, and their unborn child was living a double life. The perfect facade they'd maintained for friends and family was built on deception and betrayal. Sarah looked at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, seeing a pregnant woman whose world had just shattered. Tomorrow she would need to decide what to do with the terrible knowledge she'd gained. But tonight, she would grieve for the life she'd thought she was living and prepare for whatever came next. The baby kicked strongly against her ribs, as if sensing the emotional turmoil and offering its own form of comfort. Sarah placed her hands on her belly and made a silent promise, whatever happened between her and David. She would protect this child and find a way to build a stable, honest life for both of them. The first crack in her perfect life had appeared, and Sarah knew there was no going back to ignorant bliss. The only path forward led through the painful truth, wherever that might take them. Sarah spent the sleepless night staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through the evidence she'd discovered and the implications for her future. By morning, she'd reached a decision that both terrified and empowered her. She needed to see David and Jessica together with her own eyes, to witness the betrayal firsthand before determining her next steps. David left for the office early, claiming an important video conference with their Tokyo partners. His kiss goodbye felt perfunctory, distracted, confirming Sarah's growing sense that she'd become an afterthought in his increasingly complicated life. After he departed, Sarah called Maria from the nursery, surrounded by the symbols of hope and family that now felt like monuments to her naive trust. "I need to tell you something," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her chest. "Yesterday I found evidence that David is having an affair." Maria's sharp intake of breath carried clearly through the phone. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah detailed her discoveries, the hotel receipts, jewelry purchases, restaurant charges, and finally the necklace hidden in David's car. With each revelation, the betrayal felt more real and more devastating. "I'm going to follow him today," Sarah continued. "I need to see them together before I decide what to do next." "Sarah, honey, are you sure that's wise? The stress could affect the baby, and seeing something like that firsthand might be more traumatic than you realize." "I'm already stressed from not knowing the truth. At least this way, I'll have concrete information instead of living in uncertainty." Maria sighed, her lawyer instincts warring with her concern for her friend's well-being. "If you're determined to do this, don't go alone. I can meet you, provide moral support." "No, I need to handle this myself, but thank you for being there when I'm ready to talk about what comes next." After ending the call, Sarah prepared for what felt like a mission rather than an ordinary afternoon. She chose comfortable clothes suitable for potentially following someone discreetly, grabbed her phone and car keys, and tried to steel herself for whatever she might witness. David's office building in downtown Hartford was a sleek 15-story glass structure that housed several technology companies. Sarah parked across the street with a clear view of the main entrance and settled in to watch. She felt simultaneously empowered by taking action and disgusted by the necessity of spying on her own husband. At 12:30, David emerged from the building with Jessica at his side. Even from a distance, Sarah could see their body language was intimate rather than professional. They walked close together, Jessica's hand occasionally touching David's arm in familiar gestures that spoke of comfort and established affection. Sarah followed their car at a careful distance, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. They drove to La Bella Vista, an upscale Italian restaurant known for romantic ambiance rather than business meetings. Sarah parked several spaces away and watched them enter together, David's hand resting possessively on the small of Jessica's back. The restaurant had large windows facing the street, allowing Sarah to observe them being seated at an intimate corner table. She could see them clearly, noting how they leaned toward each other across the small table, their conversation appearing intense and personal rather than professional. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, watching the woman she'd welcomed into her home, sharing what was obviously a romantic lunch with her husband. The betrayal felt surreal, like witnessing someone else's life rather than the destruction of her own marriage. When she could no longer bear the passive observation, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She would confront them directly, in public, forcing the truth into the open rather than continuing to live with deception. The restaurant's interior was dimly lit and elegant, designed for intimate conversations and romantic encounters. Sarah approached their table with her heart hammering against her ribs, the baby seeming to respond to her emotional state with increased movement. David saw her first, his face cycling through surprise, panic, and something that looked almost like relief. Jessica turned to see what had captured his attention, her expression shifting from confusion to calculated composure in seconds. "Sarah," David said, half rising from his chair, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I thought you had a video conference this afternoon." Jessica spoke before David could respond, her tone perfectly controlled and faintly condescending. "David mentioned you might be experiencing some anxiety during your pregnancy. It's completely normal, but following your husband to restaurants suggests you might benefit from professional help." The casual cruelty of the statement, delivered with a patronizing smile, hit Sarah like a slap. This woman had been in her home, eaten her food, accepted her hospitality, all while carrying on an affair with her husband. And now Jessica had the audacity to suggest Sarah was mentally unstable for questioning obvious deception. "Professional help for what?" Sarah asked, her voice rising slightly. "For noticing that my husband has been lying about his whereabouts and spending money on jewelry he's never given me." David's face flushed red. "Sarah, you're making a scene. We can discuss this at home like civilized adults." "Civilized adults don't have secret lunch dates with their business associates," Sarah shot back. "Civilized adults don't hide jewelry purchases and hotel receipts from their pregnant wives." Other diners had begun to notice the confrontation, their conversations quieting as they sensed drama unfolding. Sarah felt exposed and humiliated, but also strangely liberated by finally speaking the truth aloud. Jessica leaned back in her chair, observing the scene with what appeared to be clinical interest rather than guilt or remorse. "David, perhaps we should continue our meeting at the office. Your wife seems to need your attention more than our business discussions do." The dismissive way Jessica referred to her as your wife, as if Sarah were an inconvenient obligation rather than a person with legitimate concerns, triggered something fierce and protective in Sarah's chest. "I have a name," Sarah said coldly, "and I have a right to know why my husband is buying expensive jewelry for his business associate while telling me we need to budget carefully for the baby's expenses." David stood abruptly, his jaw tight with anger. We're leaving. Now. But instead of addressing Sarah, he turned to Jessica with an expression of apology and regret. I'm sorry about this. I'll call you later to reschedule our discussion. The tender way he spoke to Jessica, the protective concern in his voice, made it clear where his loyalties lay. Sarah watched her husband choose his mistress over his pregnant wife in a public restaurant, prioritizing Jessica's comfort over Sarah's legitimate need for honesty. Don't bother coming home tonight, Sarah said quietly, the words emerging from some deep well of self-respect she hadn't known still existed. I'll be changing the locks. David's expression shifted to panic. Sarah, you're being dramatic. We can work this out if you'll just be reasonable. Reasonable? Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of months of suppressed frustration. I've been reasonable for 8 months while you've been living a double life. I've been reasonable while you've prioritized every business meeting over our relationship. I've been reasonable while you've made me feel crazy for noticing obvious lies. Jessica stood gracefully, gathering her purse with practiced elegance. I think it's best if I leave you two to sort this out privately. As she passed Sarah's chair, Jessica paused and spoke in a voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. He was never going to leave you during the pregnancy, but after the baby comes, things will be different. You should start preparing yourself for that reality. The words hit Sarah like ice water, confirming her worst fears while simultaneously revealing the calculated nature of Jessica's involvement in their marriage's destruction. This wasn't a spontaneous affair born of unexpected attraction. It was a deliberate strategy with a timeline and expected outcome. Sarah watched Jessica leave the restaurant with the confident stride of a woman who believed she'd already won. David seemed torn between following his mistress and managing his wife's very public emotional breakdown. Sarah, please, David said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a soothing tone. Let's go home and discuss this rationally. You're upsetting yourself and the baby. The baby, Sarah laughed bitterly. Now you're concerned about the baby. When was the last time you asked about my appointments or showed any interest in our child's development? David's silence answered the question more effectively than any words could have. He'd become so absorbed in his affair that their pregnancy had faded into irrelevant background noise. I want a divorce, Sarah said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. I want you out of the house, and I want a fair settlement that ensures our child's security. You don't mean that, David replied, but his tone lacked conviction. You're emotional right now. Once you calm down, we can work through this like adults. Sarah stood carefully, her pregnant body requiring deliberate movement. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. This marriage is over. David, the only question now is whether we handle the divorce with dignity or if you force me to expose every detail of your affair in court. As she walked toward the restaurant exit, Sarah heard David calling her name, but she didn't turn around. The confrontation had provided the clarity she needed, even if the truth was more devastating than she'd imagined. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and determination. Sarah had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, had spoken truths that couldn't be taken back. Her marriage was officially over, even if the legal proceedings lay ahead. But as she pulled into their circular driveway, Sarah felt something unexpected alongside the grief and anger relief. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by painful clarity. She knew exactly where she stood now, and she could begin planning accordingly. The baby kicked strongly as Sarah sat in her car, gathering strength for whatever came next. She placed her hands on her belly and made another promise they would survive this betrayal and build something better from the ruins of her shattered trust. The first confrontation was over, but Sarah suspected the real battle for her future was just beginning. The rain began as Sarah sat in her car outside the restaurant, sheets of water cascading down her windshield like the tears she couldn't seem to stop. The confrontation with David and Jessica played on repeat in her mind, each cruel word and dismissive gesture cutting deeper with each mental replay. Her phone buzzed with David's number, but she declined the call, then again, and again. After the fifth attempt, she finally answered. Sarah, where are you? We need to talk about this reasonably. I'm going home to pack your belongings, Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. You can pick them up tomorrow. You can't just throw me out of my own house. David's voice carried a sharp edge now, the false concern replaced by anger. I pay the mortgage. I own the business that supports our lifestyle. You're being completely irrational. The casual way he threatened her financial security felt like another slap. Sarah had given up her lucrative career to support his ambitions and manage their domestic life, making her economically vulnerable in exactly the way David was now exploiting. We'll see what the divorce courts think about rational behavior, Sarah replied before hanging up. The drive home through the storm felt apocalyptic, the weather matching her emotional state as she navigated familiar streets that now seemed foreign and threatening. Everything looked different through the lens of betrayal and impending divorce. At home, Sarah moved through the house like a woman possessed, gathering David's belongings with mechanical efficiency, his clothes, toiletries, business documents. Everything that belonged specifically to him went into suitcases and boxes. The physical act of erasing his presence from their shared space felt cathartic and heartbreaking simultaneously. She was folding his expensive suits when the first wave of cramping pain hit her abdomen. Sarah doubled over, gripping the dresser for support as the contraction-like sensation tightened across her belly. The baby had been unusually active all day, perhaps responding to her elevated stress levels, but this felt different and alarming. The pain subsided after a few seconds, leaving Sarah shaky and concerned. Dr. Walsh had warned about stress affecting the pregnancy, and today had been the most emotionally traumatic experience of Sarah's adult life. She tried to slow her breathing and calm her heart rate, placing protective hands over her belly. Another wave of pain, stronger this time, sent Sarah to her knees beside the bed. Something was definitely wrong. At 38 weeks, any unusual cramping could signal premature labor or other complications. Sarah reached for her phone with trembling fingers and called Dr. Walsh's emergency line. I'm experiencing severe cramping and back pain, Sarah explained to the on-call nurse. I had a very stressful day, and now I'm worried about the baby. Come to the hospital immediately, the nurse instructed. Don't drive yourself if possible. These symptoms need immediate evaluation. Sarah's hands shook as she called Maria, who answered on the first ring despite the late hour. I need you to drive me to the hospital, Sarah said without preamble. I think something's wrong with the baby. Maria arrived within 15 minutes, her face etched with concern as she helped Sarah to the car. What happened after you left the restaurant? I confronted them. I told David I wanted a divorce, and then I came home and started packing his things, and now I'm having contractions or something similar. Oh, honey. Maria's voice was thick with sympathy. Let's focus on getting you medical attention. Everything else can wait. P. The emergency room at Hartford Hospital was brightly lit and bustling with activity despite the late hour. Sarah was quickly admitted to the obstetrics unit, where nurses began monitoring her vital signs and the baby's heart rate with practiced efficiency. Dr. Walsh arrived within an hour, her professional demeanor masking what Sarah recognized as genuine concern. Tell me about your stress levels today, she said after reviewing Sarah's test results. Sarah provided a condensed version of the day's events, discovering the affair, confronting David and Jessica, demanding a divorce, and then experiencing the physical symptoms that brought her to the hospital. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, Dr. Walsh explained, studying the monitors tracking Sarah's condition. The baby's heart rate shows signs of distress, likely responding to your cardiovascular changes. We need to bring your stress levels down immediately to prevent more serious complications. What kind of complications? Sarah asked, fear sharpening her voice. Premature labor, placental abruption, or other conditions that could endanger both you and the baby. Extreme emotional stress can trigger physical responses that put pregnancy at risk. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that David's betrayal was now literally threatening their child's well-being. The affair had already destroyed their marriage. Now it was potentially harming the innocent life they'd created together. Maria sat beside Sarah's hospital bed, holding her hand while nurses came and went with medications designed to lower her blood pressure and reduce the risk of premature labor. "Have you called David?" Maria asked gently. "No," Sarah said firmly. "And I don't want him here. His presence will only increase my stress levels. He's still the baby's father. Honey, whatever happens between you two, he has a right to know about medical emergencies." Sarah knew Maria was right, but the thought of seeing David in the hospital, pretending to care about their child while his heart belonged to another woman, felt unbearable. "Can you call him? I can't handle hearing his voice right now." Maria stepped into the hallway to make the call while Sarah lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and IV lines, contemplating how quickly her life had imploded. This morning she'd been living in uncertain suspicion. Tonight she was facing potential medical complications while processing the end of her marriage. David arrived 40 minutes later, his hair disheveled and his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. He'd clearly been drinking, probably drowning his sorrows with Jessica after their public confrontation. "What happened?" he demanded, addressing Maria rather than Sarah directly. "Is the baby okay?" "Your wife is experiencing stress-related complications," Maria replied coolly. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high, and the baby is showing signs of distress." David finally looked at Sarah, his expression softening slightly when he saw her connected to multiple monitoring devices. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Sarah lied. "The doctors are just being cautious." "This is exactly what I was worried about," David said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone Sarah had grown to hate. "You're letting your emotions affect your health and the baby's well-being. Maybe if you'd handled today's situation more maturely, we wouldn't be in the hospital right now." The audacity of blaming her for the medical crisis caused by his infidelity sent Sarah's blood pressure spiking again. Triggering alarms on the monitoring equipment, Maria quickly intervened. "David, I think it's best if you wait in the hallway while Sarah calms down. Your presence seems to be making her condition worse." "I'm not leaving my wife alone in the hospital," David protested, but his concerns seemed more about maintaining appearances than genuine care for Sarah's well-being. "Then focus on being supportive instead of accusatory," Maria snapped, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "Sarah needs calm and reassurance right now, not blame and criticism." Dr. Walsh returned with updated test results and a grave expression. "We need to discuss some serious concerns," she said, glancing between Sarah and David. "The stress has triggered early labor contractions, and while we've managed to slow them for now, Sarah's blood pressure remains critically elevated." "What does that mean for the baby?" Sarah asked, gripping Maria's hand tightly. "If we can't stabilize your condition, we may need to consider early delivery. At 38 weeks, the baby would likely be fine, but we prefer to avoid premature birth when possible." David paled at the mention of early delivery. "What can we do to prevent that? Eliminate the source of Sarah's stress," Dr. Walsh said bluntly. "Whatever caused today's crisis needs to be resolved or removed from her environment. Continued emotional trauma could lead to more serious complications." Sarah met David's eyes across the hospital bed, seeing the realization dawn that his affair wasn't just destroying their marriage, but now threatening their child's health. For a moment, she hoped he might experience genuine remorse, might choose his family over his mistress. Instead, David's expression hardened into familiar defensiveness. "Sarah is refusing to discuss our problems rationally. She's making unilateral decisions about our marriage without considering the consequences." "The consequences?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "You mean like the consequences of your affair? The consequences of lying to me for months? The consequences of humiliating me in a public restaurant?" The monitors began beeping again as Sarah's vital signs reflected her emotional state. Dr. Walsh intervened immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to step outside while we stabilize your wife's condition. Whatever marital issues you're dealing with need to be set aside until Sarah and the baby are medically stable. She's threatening to divorce me and take half my assets," David said, as if financial concerns were equivalent to medical emergencies. I have rights too. Maria stood abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking. Your wife is in the hospital with pregnancy complications caused by the stress of discovering your affair, and you're worried about asset protection. You're lucky she's not suing you for emotional distress on top of everything else. David left the room, but not before Sarah caught his expression of calculation rather than contrition. Even in the hospital, faced with potential harm to their child, he was thinking like a businessman protecting his interests rather than a husband concerned for his family's well-being. Over the next several hours, medical staff worked to stabilize Sarah's condition through a combination of medications, rest, and carefully monitored stress reduction. Maria stayed through the night, providing emotional support while David paced the hallways like a caged animal. As dawn broke over the hospital parking lot, Dr. Walsh delivered cautiously optimistic news. Sarah's blood pressure had stabilized, and the baby no longer showed signs of distress. However, she would need to remain on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy, with strict limitations on stress and physical activity. This means no confrontations, no major life decisions, and no situations that might trigger another crisis. Dr. Walsh explained, your body and your baby need time to recover from yesterday's trauma. Sarah nodded understanding while privately wondering how she was supposed to avoid stress while living with a cheating husband who blamed her for their problems. The medical emergency had bought her time, but it hadn't resolved the fundamental issue destroying her marriage. David returned to the room as Dr. Walsh finished her instructions, his overnight in the hospital hallway apparently having provided time for strategic thinking rather than soul-searching. I think we should postpone any major decisions until after the baby is born, he announced, as if the affair and divorce demands had been impulsive reactions rather than responses to genuine betrayal. Sarah's health has to be the priority right now. The manipulative framing of his suggestion, positioning himself as the rational protector of Sarah's well-being, made her stomach turn. But surrounded by medical equipment and facing restrictions on stress, she realized David had gained a temporary advantage through her physical vulnerability. We'll discuss everything after the baby arrives, Sarah agreed quietly, knowing she had little choice given her medical situation. But as she was discharged from the hospital later that morning, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and her unborn child. David's affair might have triggered this medical crisis, but it wouldn't determine their future. She would use the imposed period of bed rest to plan carefully for the battle ahead, ensuring she was prepared to fight for her rights and her child's security once the medical restrictions were lifted. The hospital stay had been a wake-up call about the physical toll of emotional trauma, but it had also revealed David's true priorities. When forced to choose between his family's well-being and his own interests, he'd made his selection clear. Sarah would remember that lesson when the time came to divide their assets and determine their child's future. 2 weeks of mandatory bed rest gave Sarah time to think with painful clarity about her situation. David had returned home ostensibly to care for her during the medical recovery, but his presence felt more like strategic positioning than genuine concern. He worked from his home office with the door closed, taking frequent calls that he claimed were business-related, but often involved the hushed tones and intimate laughter Sarah had learned to associate with Jessica. Maria visited daily, bringing legal documents disguised as pregnancy books and magazines. They spoke in code about asset protection and custody arrangements while David remained within earshot, both women understanding that Sarah's medical restrictions created a temporary ceasefire rather than a genuine reconciliation. The prenuptial agreement you signed includes some protective clauses, Maria explained during one of these carefully orchestrated visits, her voice casual as if discussing baby shower arrangements. But there are also some challenging provisions we'll need to address. Sarah had signed the prenup 6 years ago, trusting David's explanation that it was standard protection for entrepreneurs with significant assets. She'd been so in love and confident in their relationship that she'd barely read the details, a naivety that now seemed catastrophically short-sighted. What kind of challenges? Sarah asked, keeping her voice low despite the background noise of a cooking show on television. The agreement heavily favors the higher-earning spouse, which was David when you signed it. However, your sacrifice of career advancement to support his business ventures could be grounds for challenging certain provisions, especially regarding spousal support and asset division. Maria pulled out what appeared to be a pregnancy tracking journal, but was actually a legal brief outlining Sarah's options. The good news is that Connecticut doesn't recognize prenups that leave one spouse destitute, and courts can void agreements that seem unconscionable in light of changed circumstances. Sarah studied the documents while listening for David's footsteps, feeling like a spy in her own home. The legal analysis painted a complex picture. She had some protections, but David's superior financial resources and preparation would make the divorce battle challenging. "What about custody?" Sarah asked, the question that kept her awake at night despite her exhaustion. Connecticut courts prioritize the best interests of the child, with a preference for shared custody when both parents are fit. However, David's recent behavior and the circumstances of your hospital stay could influence the judge's decision about primary residence and decision-making authority. The relief Sarah felt was tempered by realization of the battle ahead. David was a formidable opponent with significant resources and apparently few qualms about using their child as leverage in the divorce proceedings. Their conversation was interrupted by David's emergence from his office, his expression falsely cheerful as he joined them in the living room. "How are my favorite ladies doing today?" he asked, settling into the armchair with studied casualness. "Maria, I hope you're not letting Sarah get too worked up about baby preparations." The doctor emphasized the importance of staying calm. "Sure." The patronizing way he framed Maria's visits as potentially harmful to Sarah's health was a clear warning that he was monitoring their interactions. Sarah recognized it as another manipulation tactic, designed to isolate her from support systems under the guise of medical concern. "We're just discussing nursery decorating and shower planning," Maria replied smoothly. "Nothing stressful, just happy anticipation." David nodded approvingly, but Sarah caught the calculating look in his eyes. He suspected they were discussing more than baby preparations, but couldn't prove it without seeming paranoid or controlling. "I have some good news to share," David announced, his tone suggesting the news was more strategic than celebratory. "The Singapore expansion is moving forward ahead of schedule. Jessica's contacts have secured additional funding that should ensure the company's stability for years to come." The casual mention of Jessica felt like a test, gauging Sarah's reaction to determine whether her medical crisis had genuinely changed her perspective on the affair. Sarah forced herself to remain expressionless, though her heart rate increased enough to make her dizzy. "That's wonderful," Sarah said carefully. "Financial stability will be important for our growing family." David's smile seemed genuine for the first time in weeks. "Exactly. I'm glad you're starting to see the bigger picture. Jessica's contributions to the business benefit all of us, including the baby." The twisted logic of positioning his mistress as a family benefactor was breathtaking in its audacity. David was essentially asking Sarah to be grateful for Jessica's presence in their lives while simultaneously having an affair with her. Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her professional composure barely containing her outrage at David's manipulation. "Speaking of family benefits, have you two discussed any changes to your life insurance policies or estate planning with the baby coming?" The question was clearly calculated to gather information about David's assets and financial planning, but he seemed to interpret it as normal prenatal preparation. "Our lawyers are updating everything to include the baby as a beneficiary," David replied. "Though given Sarah's recent health scare, we should probably also discuss guardianship arrangements in case something happens during delivery." The casual way he referenced potential complications during Sarah's delivery sent ice through her veins. Was he hoping for problems that might resolve his marital complications? The thought was too dark to contemplate seriously, but David's coldness throughout the medical crisis had revealed disturbing aspects of his character. "Modern obstetrics makes serious complications very rare," Maria said firmly. "Sarah is young and healthy, with excellent medical care. There's no reason to expect anything but a normal delivery." David shrugged as if the topic held only academic interest. "Of course, I just believe in being prepared for all possibilities." After Maria left, David's facade of attentive husband caring for his pregnant wife began to slip. He spent increasing amounts of time in his office, often speaking in low voices that carried the intimate tones Sarah recognized from his calls with Jessica. The pretense of working solely with business contacts became thinner each day. 3 weeks into her bed rest, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. David had left his laptop open in the kitchen while taking a shower, and Sarah glimpsed an email notification from Jessica with the subject line, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Despite her medical restrictions and the risk of triggering another crisis, Sarah couldn't resist opening the email. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. "My darling David, these weeks of pretending to stay away while you play devoted husband have been torture. I know we agreed to wait until after Sarah delivers to make our relationship public, but I'm losing patience with this charade. The lawyer you recommended says your prenup should protect most of your assets, especially if Sarah can be portrayed as an unstable mother due to her recent hospitalization. I love you, and I want to start our real life together. Tonight at the usual place, all my love. Jay." Sarah's hands shook as she read the email, each word feeling like another nail in the coffin of her marriage. David and Jessica had been planning the end of her marriage while she lay in the hospital worried about their child's health. They'd consulted lawyers about asset protection and discussed strategies for undermining her credibility as a mother. The email revealed the full scope of their deception. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated strategy to replace Sarah with Jessica while minimizing David's financial losses. Her hospitalization hadn't been a wake-up call about the importance of family. It had been an opportunity to position her as mentally unstable and unfit for custody. Sarah quickly forwarded the email to her own account, then deleted it from David's sent folder and cleared his browser history. Her heart pounded with the familiar stress response that had landed her in the hospital, but this time she felt empowered by knowledge rather than weakened by uncertainty. When David emerged from the shower, Sarah was back in bed with her laptop closed, pretending to nap. He kissed her forehead with what she now recognized as practiced deception, then left for his business dinner with renewed energy. Alone in the house, Sarah called Maria despite the late hour. "I have evidence," Sarah said without preamble. Email correspondence between David and Jessica discussing their strategy for the divorce, including plans to use my hospitalization against me in custody proceedings. Maria's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "That's incredibly valuable. Can you forward it to me securely?" "Already done. Maria, they've been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The affair isn't just emotional or physical. It's part of a deliberate strategy to replace me while protecting David's assets." "This changes everything," Maria said, her lawyer instincts fully engaged. "With evidence of premeditation and strategic planning, we can challenge the prenup and argue that David has been acting in bad faith throughout your marriage. The fact that they discussed using your medical crisis against you will play very poorly with family court judges." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something approaching hope. The devastating email that had initially crushed her spirit had actually provided the evidence needed to level the playing field in divorce proceedings. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked. "We wait until after the baby is born and you're medically cleared for normal activity. Then we file for divorce with a comprehensive petition that includes this evidence and seeks full custody based on David's misconduct and fitness as a parent." Full custody? Sarah hadn't dared hope for such an outcome. A father who conspires with his mistress to undermine his wife's mental health while she's carrying his child demonstrates questionable judgment and priorities. Combined with evidence of deliberate deception and strategic planning to harm your interests, we have a strong case for arguing that shared custody isn't in the child's best interests. Sarah felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, as if responding to the promise of protection and stability. "How long do we have to keep this secret? Until you deliver safely and recover enough to handle the stress of legal proceedings? David clearly believes he has the upper hand because of your medical restrictions and his financial resources. Let him continue believing that while we prepare our case." After ending the call, Sarah lay in the darkened bedroom contemplating the irony of her situation. David's email to Jessica, intended to coordinate their strategy against her, had instead provided the ammunition needed to defeat them. His overconfidence and poor digital security had given Sarah the evidence she needed to fight back effectively. The next morning, David was unusually attentive, bringing her breakfast in bed and asking about her comfort level with obvious concern. Sarah realized he was overcompensating for his guilt about the previous night's meeting with Jessica, trying to maintain the facade of devoted husband while planning her replacement. "How are you feeling about everything?" David asked, settling beside her on the bed with studied casualness. "I know the past few weeks have been stressful, but I think we're finding our way back to each other." The blatant lie, delivered with such apparent sincerity, would have devastated Sarah weeks earlier. Now it simply confirmed her decision to proceed with the divorce as soon as medically feasible. "I'm focused on staying healthy for the baby," Sarah replied honestly. "Everything else can wait until after delivery." David smiled and squeezed her hand, apparently interpreting her response as acceptance of their situation rather than strategic patience. That's exactly the right attitude. Jessica always says that successful people know when to prioritize long-term stability over short-term emotions. The casual way he quoted his mistress's wisdom about their marriage was staggering in its audacity, but Sarah simply nodded and smiled. David's overconfidence was becoming her greatest asset, encouraging him to reveal information and strategies that would ultimately be used against him. As her due date approached, Sarah felt increasingly confident about the battle ahead. David believed he held all the advantages: superior financial resources, legal preparation, and a pregnant wife restricted by medical concerns. What he didn't realize was that Sarah now possessed the evidence needed to expose his deception and challenge his assumptions about the divorce outcome. The legal battlefield was being prepared while David remained focused on his affair, unaware that his own emails had armed his opponent with the weapons needed to fight back effectively. Sarah's labor began at 3 in the morning on a cold February night, 6 weeks after she'd discovered David's email to Jessica. The contractions started slowly, allowing her time to prepare mentally for what would be both the birth of her child and the beginning of the end of her marriage. David drove her to the hospital with apparent concern, holding her hand between contractions and speaking reassuringly about their future as parents. Sarah found his performance almost impressive in its sincerity, knowing that within days he would be served with divorce papers that would shatter his carefully constructed plans. The delivery was long and complicated, lasting 18 hours before their daughter finally arrived. Emma Michelle Mitchell entered the world at 6:47 p.m., weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces. With David's dark hair and Sarah's determined expression, the moment Sarah held her daughter for the first time, everything else fell into perspective. This tiny, perfect person was worth every battle that lay ahead. David seemed genuinely moved by Emma's arrival, tears streaming down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. For a brief moment, Sarah wondered if becoming a father might change his priorities, might make him reconsider his affair and choose his family over Jessica. That hope was shattered 3 days later when Sarah overheard David on the phone while she was nursing Emma in the hospital room. He'd stepped into the hallway, but hadn't moved far enough to prevent his words from carrying clearly. "She's beautiful, Jessica. I can't wait for you to meet her. Yes, I know we agreed to wait, but seeing Emma makes me more determined than ever to create the family life I want. Sarah's been so focused on the baby that I think she's accepted our situation. The transition should be smoother than we expected." Sarah's milk supply faltered as stress hormones flooded her system, causing Emma to fuss and cry. The casual way David discussed introducing his mistress to their newborn daughter, as if Jessica would naturally assume a maternal role in Emma's life, was breathtakingly presumptuous. When David returned to the room, his expression was carefully composed into new father joy. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, approaching the bed with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Emma's having trouble nursing," Sarah said honestly. "The lactation consultant thinks it might be stress-related." David frowned with what seemed like genuine concern. what kind of stress you should be feeling happy and relieved now that she's here safely. The irony of him asking about stress while actively planning to introduce their newborn to his mistress was almost enough to make Sarah laugh bitterly. Instead, she simply nodded and continued attempting to soothe Emma. 2 weeks after Emma's birth, Sarah felt physically recovered enough to proceed with the divorce filing. Maria had prepared all the necessary paperwork during Sarah's bed rest, incorporating the email evidence and building a comprehensive case for both asset division and primary custody. "Are you ready for this?" Maria asked as they sat in her law office while Emma slept peacefully in her carrier. "Once we file these papers, there's no going back to the status quo." "I've been ready since I found that email," Sarah replied. "David made his choice when he decided to plan my replacement while I was carrying his child." The divorce petition was comprehensive and devastating. It included David's email correspondence with Jessica, evidence of hidden assets and secret meetings, documentation of his emotional abandonment during Sarah's pregnancy, and a detailed argument for why shared custody was not in Emma's best interests, given David's demonstrated priorities. David was served with the papers at his office on a Thursday afternoon, ensuring he would have the weekend to process the information before they had to interact about Emma's care. Sarah spent that weekend at Maria's house, wanting to avoid the initial explosion of David's anger when he realized how thoroughly she documented his deception. The phone calls started Saturday morning and continued throughout the weekend. David's messages evolved from surprise to anger to attempted negotiation, each voicemail revealing more about his mindset and strategy. "Sarah, this is insane. You can't seriously expect a judge to give you full custody based on some private emails. I'm a good father, and Emma needs both parents in her life. I've spoken with my lawyers, and they say your petition is vindictive and unrealistic. The prenup will hold up in court, and you'll get far less than you're demanding. We need to discuss this rationally. Jessica thinks you're having some kind of postpartum breakdown. Maybe we should get you psychological evaluation before proceeding with this ridiculous lawsuit." The final message revealed David's true strategy. "I'm not going to let you destroy my business and steal my daughter because you can't handle adult relationships. Jessica and I are planning to marry after our divorce is final, and Emma will benefit from having a stable stepmother who understands business and success." Sarah listened to each message with growing amazement at David's capacity for self-deception. He genuinely seemed to believe that his affair was a rational business decision, and that Sarah's response was emotionally unstable rather than legally justified. Monday morning brought David's counterattack. His lawyers filed a response that challenged Sarah's fitness as a mother, citing her hospitalization during pregnancy and requesting psychological evaluation before custody decisions were made. They also disputed the relevance of the email evidence, claiming private correspondence had been obtained illegally. Maria reviewed the response with professional detachment that barely concealed her outrage. "This is exactly what we expected. David's team is trying to flip the narrative, making you the unstable party while positioning him as the responsible parent concerned about Emma's welfare." "Will it work?" Sarah asked, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms as if unaware that her future was being decided in legal documents. "Not with the evidence we have. David's own emails prove premeditation and callous disregard for your well-being during a vulnerable time. No family court judge will view that favorably, especially when combined with his obvious priority of protecting assets over family stability." The first court appearance was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to gather additional evidence and prepare their cases. Sarah used that time to document everything: David's limited involvement in Emma's daily care, his continued secretive phone calls with Jessica, and his obvious prioritization of business concerns over parental responsibilities. David, meanwhile, seemed to believe that demonstrating his financial success would overshadow questions about his character and priorities. He arranged for prominent business associates to provide character references and commission reports showing the stability and growth of his company, as if earning potential was the primary qualification for parenthood. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jessica, apparently growing impatient with the slow pace of divorce proceedings, made a crucial mistake that would undermine David's entire strategy. Sarah discovered the mistake through David's careless digital security habits. He'd left his personal email open on the shared computer in the kitchen, and Sarah found a message from Jessica that revealed the full scope of their planning. "Darling, I understand you want to protect Emma's relationship with Sarah, but we need to be realistic about custody arrangements. A newborn needs consistency and stability, which means living primarily with the parent who can provide the best environment. My experience helping to raise my sister's children, combined with our superior financial resources and stable relationship, makes us the logical choice for primary custody. Sarah can have generous visitation rights, but Emma's daily care should be with us." The lawyers say this argument will be more persuasive than trying to prove Sarah is unfit. "We're not attacking her character, just demonstrating that we can provide a better environment for Emma's development." The email revealed that Jessica wasn't just David's mistress. She was actively strategizing about taking primary custody of Emma. She saw herself not as a future stepmother with limited involvement, but as Emma's primary caretaker, with Sarah relegated to weekend visitation. Sarah forwarded the email to Maria immediately, recognizing it as potential evidence of interference with parental rights and further proof of David's misplaced priorities. "This is gold," Maria said during their next meeting. "Jessica's involvement in custody strategy demonstrates that David is prioritizing his mistress's opinions over the mother of his child. No judge will view that favorably." The email also revealed another disturbing element: Jessica's claim about experience raising children. Sarah remembered Jessica mentioning a sister, but had never heard about her helping to raise children. It seemed Jessica was either exaggerating her qualifications or had hidden important biographical information from everyone who knew her. "Should we investigate Jessica's background more thoroughly?" Sarah asked. "Absolutely. If she's going to position herself as a superior parental figure, we need to verify her claims and look for any information that might discredit her judgment or stability." The private investigator Maria hired uncovered information that would prove devastating to David's case. Jessica Chen had never helped raise her sister's children in any meaningful capacity. Her sister lived in California and had two teenage sons who barely knew their aunt. More damaging still, Jessica had been involved in a messy breakup with her previous boyfriend, who had accused her of deliberately sabotaging his relationship with his ex-wife to position herself as his children's primary female influence. The pattern was clear: Jessica had a history of inserting herself into existing family structures and attempting to replace the biological mother. Her involvement with David wasn't just an affair. It was part of a calculated pattern of behavior designed to acquire the family life she wanted by displacing other women. Armed with this information, Sarah felt confident going into the first court hearing. David's strategy of portraying himself as the stable, financially superior parent was about to collide with evidence of his involvement with a woman who had a pattern of targeting married fathers and attempting to replace their children's mothers. As Emma's first month of life drew to a close, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since discovering David's affair. She'd evolved from a betrayed wife seeking answers to a strategic opponent prepared to fight for her daughter's future. The legal battlefield was complex and challenging, but Sarah now possessed the weapons needed to protect Emma and secure their future together. The confrontation in the restaurant felt like ancient history compared to the sophisticated legal war being waged over Emma's custody and Sarah's financial security. David had underestimated his wife's intelligence and determination, assuming that pregnancy and new motherhood would make her passive and dependent. Instead, those experiences had revealed reserves of strength Sarah hadn't known she possessed, transforming her from victim to victor in the battle for their family's future. The first custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, with Emma just 6 weeks old. Sarah sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Maria, reviewing their strategy while Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, unaware that her future was about to be decided by strangers in black robes. "Remember," Maria coached, "stay calm regardless of what David's lawyers claim. They're going to try to provoke an emotional response that makes you seem unstable. Your composure is your greatest asset." Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted Emma's blanket. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of depositions, document discovery, and strategic planning. David's legal team had been aggressive in their attempts to portray Sarah as an unfit mother, citing her hospitalization during pregnancy and claiming she was suffering from untreated postpartum depression. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the medical crisis caused by discovering David's affair was now being used against her in court. But Maria had prepared comprehensive medical testimony showing that Sarah's hospitalization was a reasonable response to extreme emotional trauma, not evidence of mental instability. David entered the courthouse with his lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Henley, who specialized in high-asset divorces. Jessica was notably absent, following their legal team's advice to avoid appearing as the cause of the marriage's breakdown during custody proceedings. The hearing began with procedural matters, both sides presenting their basic positions on custody and support arrangements. Sarah requested primary custody, with David having supervised visitation until he could demonstrate that his affair wouldn't impact his parenting decisions. David's team countered with a request for shared custody and challenged Sarah's fitness as a mother. Judge Rebecca Morrison presided with the no-nonsense demeanor Sarah had hoped for, a family court veteran with a reputation for prioritizing children's welfare over parental convenience. Judge Morrison had reviewed all submitted documents and seemed unimpressed by David's financial arguments. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison addressed David directly, "I've reviewed the evidence regarding your extramarital relationship and the timing of this custody dispute. Can you explain how your personal choices serve your daughter's best interests?" David's prepared response sounded rehearsed and hollow. "Your Honor, my relationship with Miss Chen developed during a period when my marriage was already troubled. I believe Emma benefits from having both parents actively involved in her life, regardless of the status of our marriage. And you believe introducing a 6-week-old infant to your girlfriend serves her best interests?" Judge Morrison's tone suggested skepticism. "Jessica has extensive experience with children and would be a positive influence in Emma's life. My wife's recent hospitalization and emotional instability concern me more than my personal relationships." Sarah felt her jaw clench at David's casual dismissal of their marriage as troubled, rewriting history to justify his betrayal. But she remained silent, following Maria's coaching about maintaining composure. Maria presented Sarah's case methodically, beginning with David's email correspondence with Jessica and demonstrating the premeditated nature of their relationship. She then introduced evidence of Jessica's pattern of inserting herself into existing families and David's prioritization of business interests over parental responsibilities. "Your Honor," Maria concluded, "Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated through his own communications that he views this child as an asset to be managed rather than a daughter to be protected. His immediate plans to introduce his mistress as a parental figure show dangerous poor judgment that puts Emma's emotional development at risk." David's attorney attempted to discredit the email evidence and portray Sarah's hospitalization as proof of mental instability. But Judge Morrison seemed unpersuaded by their arguments. "I'm going to order a temporary custody arrangement while we await the guardian ad litem's report," Judge Morrison announced. "Emma will remain primarily with her mother, with Mr. Mitchell having supervised daytime visitation 3 times per week. Both parents will undergo psychological evaluation, and Mr. Mitchell will attend co-parenting classes before any overnight visitation is considered." Sarah felt relief flood through her chest. The temporary order was better than she'd hoped, giving her primary custody while David's visitation was limited and supervised. But David's reaction was more strategic than emotional. As they left the courthouse, he approached Sarah with an expression of calculated humility rather than anger. "Sarah, this isn't how I wanted things to go," he said quietly. "Maybe we should consider mediation instead of continuing this courtroom battle. It's not good for Emma to have her parents fighting like this." The sudden shift from adversarial legal strategy to reasonable co-parent concerned Sarah more than his previous aggression. David was too strategic to abandon his legal position without good reason. "I'm open to mediation if you're genuinely committed to putting Emma's needs first," Sarah replied carefully. "That's all I've ever wanted," David said with apparent sincerity. "I think I got caught up in protecting my business interests and lost sight of what really matters. Maybe we can find a way to co-parent effectively, even if our marriage can't be saved. Over the following weeks, David's behavior seemed to support his claims about change priorities. He attended every scheduled visitation with Emma, brought thoughtful gifts for Sarah, and spoke respectfully about their need to work together as parents despite their personal differences. He also made no apparent contact with Jessica, at least not in any way Sarah could detect. His phone calls were conducted openly, his schedule was transparent, and he seemed genuinely focused on learning to care for Emma during their visitation periods. The change was so dramatic that Sarah began to wonder if becoming a father had indeed shifted David's perspective. Perhaps the reality of holding his daughter had made him reconsider his priorities and the importance of family stability. Maria remained skeptical during their weekly meetings. Leopards don't change their spots overnight, she warned. David is a strategic thinker who's probably recognized that his previous approach wasn't working in court. This could be a calculated attempt to appear reformed while he develops a new strategy. But as weeks passed without any evidence of continued deception, Sarah found herself cautiously hopeful. David's transformation seemed genuine, supported by consistent actions rather than just words. He'd enrolled in parenting classes without court requirement, suggested family counseling to address their marriage issues, and even proposed a trial separation rather than immediate divorce to see if they could rebuild trust. The turning point came 6 weeks after the first hearing, when David made an unexpected proposal during one of his visits with Emma. "I've been thinking about what's best for our family," he said, sitting on the couch while Emma slept in his arms. "Maybe Jessica was right about one thing: Emma needs stability and consistency. But I was wrong about who should provide that." Sarah looked up from the baby bottle she was washing, surprised by his serious tone. "I want to try again," David continued. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I know you have every reason not to trust me. But seeing Emma, being her father, has made me realize what I was throwing away. Jessica was a distraction from problems in our marriage that I should have addressed directly with you." The admission felt too good to be true, but David's expression seemed genuinely remorseful. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying I want to end the affair completely and focus on rebuilding our marriage. I want to go to counseling, work on the issues that led to my poor decisions, and prove that I can be the husband and father you both deserve." Sarah studied David's face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. What she saw instead was something she hadn't witnessed in months: vulnerability and genuine emotion. "What about Jessica?" Sarah asked. "I've already told her that our relationship is over. She wasn't happy about it, but she understood that my daughter has to come first. I made a terrible mistake that nearly cost me everything important in my life." That evening, Sarah called Maria to discuss David's proposal. Her friend's reaction was predictably cautious. "It's possible that he's genuine," Maria conceded. "Becoming a parent can be transformative for some people. But Sarah, you need to protect yourself and Emma. If you're going to consider reconciliation, it needs to be gradual and include verification of his claims." "What kind of verification?" "Proof that he's actually ended the affair, transparency about his business activities, joint counseling with specific goals, and legal modifications to your prenup that protect you if he betrays your trust again." The conditions seemed reasonable, and Sarah was surprised when David agreed to all of them without argument. He provided his phone records, email access, and business calendar for Sarah's review. He scheduled appointments with a highly regarded marriage counselor and expressed willingness to modify their prenuptial agreement to provide better protection for Sarah and Emma. For the first time in months, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about their future. David's transformation seemed genuine and comprehensive, affecting not just his relationship with Jessica, but his overall approach to marriage and fatherhood. They attended their first counseling session together 2 weeks later, with Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier while they spoke to Dr. Rachel Stevens about rebuilding trust and communication. David was remarkably open about his mistakes, taking full responsibility for the affair and its impact on their family. "I got caught up in the excitement of business success and lost sight of what really mattered," he admitted to Dr. Stevens. Jessica represented everything that felt easy and uncomplicated. While my marriage required work and sacrifice, I took the coward's way out instead of addressing our problems directly. Sarah found herself moved by David's honesty and apparent insight into his behavior. The counseling session seemed to be revealing a man who had genuinely learned from his mistakes and was committed to change. But even as she allowed herself to hope for reconciliation, a small voice in the back of Sarah's mind wondered if David's transformation was too complete, too perfect to be entirely genuine. The strategic thinker who had planned her replacement so carefully seemed unlikely to have such a sudden and total change of heart. Those doubts felt like residual trauma from the betrayal rather than genuine intuition. So Sarah pushed them aside and focused on the evidence of David's reformed behavior. Emma deserved a chance to grow up with both parents, and Sarah deserved the opportunity to see if their marriage could be rebuilt on more honest foundations. The reconciliation felt fragile but promising, like the first green shoots of spring after a devastating winter. Sarah allowed herself to believe that David's love for Emma had indeed changed his priorities, and that their family might emerge stronger from the crisis that had nearly destroyed them. She had no way of knowing that David's apparent transformation was the most sophisticated manipulation yet, designed to regain her trust long enough to implement a strategy that would leave her more vulnerable than ever before. 3 months into their reconciliation attempt, Sarah began to believe that David's transformation was genuine. He attended every counseling session, participated actively in Emma's daily care, and seemed to have completely severed contact with Jessica. Their marriage counselor, Dr. Stevens, commented on David's remarkable progress in taking responsibility for his actions and developing better communication skills. Sarah's guard was finally beginning to lower when she received a text message that would shatter her newfound sense of security. The message came from the same unknown number that had previously warned her about David's car, but this time the content was more urgent. He's been meeting Jessica at her new apartment, Thursdays at 2 p.m. while you're at Emma's pediatrician appointments. She's been hiding there since the reconciliation started. You need to see this. Attached to the message was a photograph taken through a window, showing David and Jessica in an intimate embrace inside what appeared to be a luxury apartment. The timestamp showed it was taken the previous Thursday, during what David had claimed was an important business meeting. Sarah's hands shook as she studied the image, recognition dawning that David's entire reconciliation had been an elaborate performance designed to make her drop her guard. The counseling sessions, the apparent change in priorities, the loving attention to Emma, all of it had been calculated to convince her that the threat was over while he continued the affair more carefully. The realization that she'd been systematically deceived for months sent Sarah into an emotional spiral that felt even worse than discovering the original affair. This betrayal was more sophisticated, more cruelly planned, taking advantage of her desire to believe in their family's future. Emma began crying in her bouncy seat, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Sarah picked up her daughter and tried to calm her own racing heart while processing the implications of David's deception. If he could lie so convincingly during counseling sessions and court proceedings, what else was he planning that evening? David returned from work with his usual post-reconciliation demeanor, attentive, affectionate, and apparently transparent about his day's activities. He kissed Sarah hello, played with Emma for 30 minutes, and asked about her day with what seemed like genuine interest. "How did Emma's pediatrician appointment go?" he asked as they prepared dinner together, the very appointment he'd used as cover for meeting Jessica. "Fine," Sarah replied, studying his face for any sign of guilt or deception. "Dr. Martinez says she's developing perfectly. How was your afternoon meeting?" "Productive," David said smoothly. "We're making good progress on the overseas partnerships. It's taking longer than expected, but the foundation we're building should benefit Emma's future." The casual way he lied while referencing their daughter's welfare was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah realized that David had perfected the art of deception, incorporating just enough truth to make his lies believable, while manipulating her desire to trust him. She excused herself to put Emma down for the night, using the privacy to call Maria from the nursery. "He's still seeing her," Sarah whispered into the phone. "The whole reconciliation has been a lie, I have photographic evidence from this afternoon. Maria's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Forward me everything immediately. This changes our entire legal strategy. David has been committing perjury in court documents and lying to court-ordered counselors. Judge Morrison will not respond well to this level of deception. What should I do right now? He's downstairs making dinner like the devoted husband. And I don't know how to pretend everything's normal. Act normally until we can get back into court with this evidence. If you confront him now, he'll just develop a more sophisticated deception strategy. We need to document his lies in counseling and court filings first. Sarah spent the evening maintaining the facade of their happy reconciliation while internally cataloging every lie David told. He spoke about his business meetings with apparent honesty, discussed their weekend plans with enthusiasm, and even mentioned how much progress they were making in counseling. Dr. Stevens thinks we're doing remarkably well for couples recovering from infidelity, David said as they watched television together, Emma sleeping peacefully between them. She mentioned that most marriages don't survive affairs, but our commitment to Emma is making the difference. The irony of him praising their commitment while actively betraying it made Sarah feel physically ill, but she smiled and agreed, playing her part in the deception while gathering information for the legal battle ahead. The next morning, after David left for work, Sarah met with Maria to plan their response to the new evidence. The photographs and David's continued lies during court-ordered counseling created grounds for modifying the custody arrangement and potentially charging him with contempt of court. The timing is particularly damaging, Maria explained. David has been lying to a court-appointed counselor while under temporary custody orders. Judge Morrison takes compliance with court orders very seriously, and David's deception undermines every argument his lawyers have made about his fitness as a parent. They scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week, giving Sarah time to gather additional evidence of David's continued deception. The anonymous tipster had proven remarkably well-informed, providing specific details about David and Jessica's meetings that Sarah was able to verify through careful observation. David's Thursday afternoon pattern was exactly as described. He would leave work early, claiming business meetings, and spend 2 hours at Jessica's apartment before returning home with elaborate stories about client negotiations and partnership discussions. Sarah confirmed the pattern by hiring a private investigator recommended by Maria, who documented David's visits to Jessica's apartment building and captured additional photographs of their continued affair. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, showing that David's reconciliation had been a complete fabrication. But David's deception went deeper than just continuing the affair. Sarah discovered that he'd been using their reconciliation to gather information about her legal strategy, pumping her for details about Maria's advice and her long-term plans for custody and support arrangements. The revelation came during one of their counseling sessions, when David asked seemingly innocent questions about Sarah's relationship with her lawyer and whether she was still planning to proceed with the divorce. Dr. Stevens had encouraged open communication about their legal situation, not realizing that David was using the counseling environment to conduct reconnaissance for his legal team. I want to make sure we're both committed to making this work, David said during the session. If you're still planning to divorce me regardless of our progress, it affects how I approach our reconciliation. Sarah now recognized the question as strategic rather than emotional, designed to determine whether she was genuinely committed to rebuilding their marriage or simply gathering evidence for divorce proceedings. I want our marriage to work, Sarah replied honestly, but I need to see consistent change over time before I'm comfortable dropping the legal protections I've put in place. David nodded understandingly, but Sarah caught a flicker of calculation in his expression that suggested he was processing the information for strategic purposes rather than emotional healing. The private investigator's final report revealed the full scope of David's ongoing deception. Not only was he continuing his affair with Jessica, but they were actively planning their future together while he maintained the reconciliation facade with Sarah. Bank records showed that David had been paying Jessica's apartment rent and expenses, essentially supporting 2 households while claiming financial constraints in divorce proceedings. Credit card statements revealed expensive gifts and romantic dinners that coincided with his claimed business meetings. Most damaging of all, the investigator had obtained recordings of David and Jessica discussing their long-term strategy. Jessica's apartment had been bugged by a previous tenant involved in his own divorce case, and the recordings had been provided to Sarah's investigator by someone familiar with the building's history. The recordings revealed conversations that would destroy David's credibility in court. "The counseling is working perfectly." David's voice was clear on the recording. "Sarah actually believes I've changed. She's becoming careless about protecting her legal interests because she thinks we're rebuilding trust." Jessica's response was equally damaging. "Good, right? Once she drops her guard completely, we can implement the custody strategy your lawyer suggested. If Sarah appears unstable or vindictive after trusting you again, it supports our argument for primary custody." The recordings revealed that David's entire reconciliation had been designed to make Sarah appear mentally unstable when the truth eventually came out. His lawyers had advised that a pattern of Sarah trusting and then irrationally attacking David would support claims that she was suffering from postpartum depression or other mental health issues. The sophistication of the strategy was breathtaking. David hadn't just continued his affair. He'd used the reconciliation to gather intelligence and position Sarah for a more devastating legal defeat when the truth emerged. Armed with this evidence, Maria filed for an emergency custody hearing and requested that David be held in contempt of court for violating the spirit of the custody arrangement and lying during court-ordered counseling. "This is the most calculated case of parental manipulation I've seen in 20 years of family law," Maria told Sarah as they prepared for the hearing. "David has been using your love for Emma and desire to preserve your family against you in a coordinated legal strategy." The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Sarah less than a week to prepare for what would likely be the final confrontation in their custody battle. David remained unaware that his deception had been discovered, continuing to play the role of reformed husband while planning her destruction. On the Sunday before the hearing, David suggested they take Emma to the park for family photos, claiming he wanted to document their progress in rebuilding their relationship. Sarah agreed, knowing it would likely be one of the last times she would have to maintain the pretense of their reconciliation. As they walked through the park with Emma in her stroller, David spoke enthusiastically about their future together and his gratitude for Sarah's willingness to give him a second chance. The performance was flawless, supported by months of practice and careful observation of what Sarah wanted to hear. "I know I have a lot more work to do to earn back your trust completely," David said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders as they sat on a park bench watching other families. "But being here with you and Emma feels like the life I should have been fighting for all along." Sarah smiled and leaned into his embrace, knowing it would be the last time she would allow herself to be deceived by his manipulation. Tuesday's hearing would expose the full extent of David's betrayal and end his ability to use her hopes and dreams against her. The final deception was about to be revealed, and Sarah was finally prepared to fight back with all the evidence needed to protect Emma and secure their future together. The emergency custody hearing on Tuesday morning would have felt like a victory for Sarah, if not for the devastating personal cost of David's betrayal. Judge Morrison reviewed the new evidence with barely concealed anger, her expression growing darker as Maria presented the recordings, photographs, and financial documents proving David's elaborate deception. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison addressed David directly, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority pushed to its limits. "You have lied to this court, to your court-appointed counselor, and to your wife while she was attempting to rebuild your family. Your conduct demonstrates a level of manipulation and disregard for your daughter's welfare that concerns me deeply." David's legal team scrambled to respond, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. His lawyers' attempts to characterize the deception as private marital issues rather than court violations fell flat when confronted with recordings of David explicitly discussing his strategy to manipulate the custody proceedings. "Your Honor," and David said, rising to address the court directly, "I admit I've made mistakes, but my love for my daughter is genuine. I believe Emma needs both parents in her life, regardless of the status of my marriage to her mother." Judge Morrison's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. Mitchell, your actions demonstrate that you view your daughter as a possession to be won rather than a child to be protected. Your elaborate deception during court-ordered reconciliation shows dangerous manipulation that puts Emma's emotional development at risk. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and brutal for David's case. Sarah was awarded primary custody, with David's visitation reduced to supervised visits pending psychological evaluation. More significantly, Judge Morrison found David in contempt of court for violating the spirit of the custody arrangement and ordered him to pay Sarah's legal fees. The court is particularly troubled by Mr. Mitchell's use of marriage counseling as a reconnaissance tool to gather information for his legal strategy. Judge Morrison stated, "This behavior demonstrates such poor judgment that I'm ordering immediate supervised visitation only, with any future changes requiring clear evidence of genuine rehabilitation." As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The victory was complete from a legal standpoint, but the emotional toll of months of sophisticated deception had left her feeling drained and skeptical of her own judgment. David approached her in the courthouse parking lot, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking to reveal genuine desperation underneath. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice breaking with what seemed like real emotion. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, but don't let your anger with me affect Emma's relationship with her father. She needs me in her life." The plea might have moved Sarah months earlier, but she'd learned to recognize David's manipulation tactics too well to be affected by his apparent vulnerability. "Emma needs a father who prioritizes her welfare over his own interests," Sarah replied calmly. "Your actions have proven that you're not capable of that kind of parenting. Maybe supervised visitation will teach you what being a real father means." David's expression shifted from desperation to anger as he realized that his emotional appeal had failed. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly. "I built a $47 million business from nothing. I have resources and connections you can't imagine. This isn't over." The threat felt empty given David's recent legal defeat, but it reminded Sarah that she needed to remain vigilant about protecting herself and Emma from future manipulation attempts. Over the following weeks, as the immediate crisis of the custody battle resolved, Sarah began processing the emotional impact of David's elaborate deception. The betrayal felt more devastating than the original affair because it had weaponized her hopes for their family's future against her. Dr. Stevens, their former marriage counselor, requested a meeting with Sarah to discuss the revelations about David's behavior during their sessions. The counselor's distress at being manipulated was evident, but she also provided valuable insight into David's psychological patterns. "In 20 years of practice, I've rarely seen such sophisticated emotional manipulation," Dr. Stevens admitted. "David displayed classic narcissistic behaviors: charm, strategic thinking, and complete disregard for others' emotional welfare when it conflicted with his goals." The diagnosis helped Sarah understand that David's betrayal wasn't a reflection of her inadequacy as a wife or mother, but rather evidence of his fundamental inability to prioritize others' needs over his own desires. 6 weeks after the custody hearing, Sarah received unexpected news that would change everything. Her estranged Aunt Margaret, her father's sister, had died suddenly and left Sarah her entire estate. Margaret had been a successful real estate investor who had accumulated significant wealth over decades of careful property management. The inheritance included a portfolio of rental properties worth approximately $2.8 million, investment accounts, and liquid assets that would provide Sarah with financial independence she'd never imagined possible. More importantly, it offered her the resources to start fresh without depending on David's support or remaining vulnerable to his financial manipulation. Sarah had barely known Aunt Margaret, who had lived as a recluse in Vermont after a bitter divorce in her 30s. But the accompanying letter from Margaret's attorney revealed that her aunt had followed Sarah's situation from a distance and wanted to provide her with the independence that Margaret herself had wished for during her own marital crisis. "I know what it's like to discover that the man you trusted with your heart has been planning your replacement," Margaret's letter read. "The difference is that I had no children to protect and could afford to walk away completely." You have Emma to consider, which makes your situation more complex but also more important. Use this inheritance to build the life you deserve, free from manipulation and deception. The financial windfall felt like divine intervention, providing Sarah with resources to protect Emma's future and pursue opportunities that had seemed impossible during the constraints of her marriage and divorce proceedings. Maria helped Sarah establish trusts and investment strategies that would ensure long-term security for both her and Emma. More immediately, the inheritance allowed Sarah to consider relocating to a different state if necessary to escape David's ongoing influence and manipulation attempts. You have options now, Maria observed as they reviewed Sarah's new financial position. David can't use economic pressure to control your decisions or threaten your stability. That fundamentally changes the power dynamic between you. The first decision Sarah made with her newfound independence was to purchase a beautiful colonial home in a family-friendly neighborhood 20 minutes from her current location. The house featured a large backyard for Emma to play in, excellent schools, and a supportive community of young families. David's reaction to news of Sarah's inheritance was predictably strategic rather than celebratory. He immediately petitioned the court to modify child support arrangements, claiming that Sarah's improved financial position eliminated her need for his support. But Judge Morrison was unimpressed by David's attempt to reduce his parental financial responsibilities. Mr. Mitchell's obligations to support his daughter are not diminished by the mother's good fortune. The judge ruled, child support is based on both parents' ability to contribute to their child's welfare, not just the custodial parent's need. As summer arrived, Sarah found herself settling into a new life that felt both foreign and liberating. Emma was thriving in their new home, developing her personality and reaching developmental milestones that filled Sarah with pride and joy. The constant stress of David's manipulation had been replaced by the peaceful routine of single motherhood supported by financial security. Sarah also began exploring career opportunities that had seemed impossible during her marriage. Her marketing background and David's business connections had provided her with valuable industry knowledge, and several former colleagues expressed interest in her consulting services. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that David's affair had ultimately led to her discovering strengths and resources she'd never known she possessed. The betrayal that was meant to leave her dependent and vulnerable had instead revealed her resilience and capability for independent success. David's supervised visitations with Emma continued under court order, but his behavior during these meetings revealed his ongoing inability to prioritize his daughter's needs over his own frustrations. The court-appointed supervisor noted David's tendency to use visitation time to gather information about Sarah's activities rather than focus on bonding with Emma. Mr. Mitchell frequently asked his daughter questions about her mother's routine, visitors, and activities, the supervisor reported to the court. When redirected to focus on age-appropriate interaction with Emma, Mr. Mitchell becomes frustrated and disengaged. The reports confirmed Sarah's belief that David viewed Emma primarily as a tool for accessing information about Sarah's life, rather than as a daughter deserving of his attention and care. As Emma approached her first birthday, Sarah reflected on the year that had transformed her from a betrayed wife into an independent mother with resources and options she'd never imagined. The journey had been painful and traumatic, but it had also revealed her capacity for growth and resilience in the face of sophisticated manipulation. The woman who had trusted David's explanations and made excuses for his suspicious behavior felt like a different person entirely. Sarah had developed instincts for recognizing deception, boundaries for protecting her emotional welfare, and resources for ensuring Emma's security regardless of David's future behavior. But as she planned Emma's first birthday party, Sarah remained unaware that David was developing a new strategy that would test her newfound strength and independence in ways she couldn't imagine. The battle for their daughter's future was far from over, and David's next move would require all the resilience and resources Sarah had developed during her journey from victim to victor. Emma's first birthday party was held in the backyard of Sarah's new home on a perfect September afternoon, surrounded by the friends and family who had supported them through the most difficult year of Sarah's life. As Sarah watched her daughter take her first tentative steps across the lawn, reaching for colorful balloons with determination and joy, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and hope for their future. Maria stood beside her, holding her own toddler while watching Emma's milestone moment. "Look at what you've built," Maria said quietly. "A year ago, you were in the hospital terrified about your future. Now look at this life you've created for Emma." The guest list reflected the new community Sarah had cultivated: neighbors from their family-friendly street, other young mothers from Emma's playgroup, former colleagues who had become friends and business contacts, and the chosen family of supporters who had helped them through the crisis. David was notably absent from the celebration, his supervised visitation schedule not including weekend family events. Judge Morrison had been clear that David's access to Emma needed to remain structured and supervised until he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and commitment to prioritizing his daughter's welfare over his own agenda. The past 6 months had brought significant changes to Sarah's life beyond the new house and financial security. She'd successfully launched her marketing consulting firm, leveraging her previous experience and the network she'd built during her marriage to David. The business was thriving, providing both income and personal fulfillment that reminded Sarah of her capabilities and ambitions. "I have some news to share," Sarah announced to the group as they gathered around Emma's high chair for the birthday cake ceremony. "Next month, I'll be expanding the consulting firm to include 2 associate partners, and we're opening an office in downtown Hartford." The applause and congratulations from friends felt different from the polite responses she'd received during David's business celebrations. These people were genuinely invested in Sarah's success and excited about her achievements, creating a support system based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Emma's reaction to her birthday cake was pure joy, her face lighting up as she explored the colorful frosting with her tiny fingers. Sarah captured every moment with her camera, creating memories that belonged entirely to them without the shadow of deception or manipulation that had clouded so many previous family milestones. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the community they'd built and the life they were creating together. Emma was surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally, and Sarah had proven to herself that she could provide security and happiness for both of them. But the peaceful evening was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. David arrived at Sarah's front door just as she was cleaning up from the party, his expression unreadable and his presence feeling intrusive in their carefully constructed sanctuary. "I wanted to see Emma on her birthday," David said, his tone attempting casualness but carrying undertones of entitlement that immediately put Sarah on guard. "Your visitation is scheduled for Thursday afternoons," Sarah replied calmly. "Emma's birthday party was a family event, and you chose not to be part of our family when you decided to prioritize your affair over our marriage." David's jaw tightened with familiar frustration. "She's my daughter too. Sarah, I know you're angry with me, but don't punish Emma by keeping her father away from important milestones." The manipulation attempt was obvious but still effective in triggering Sarah's guilt about Emma growing up with limited access to her father. But Sarah had learned to recognize and resist David's emotional pressure tactics. "Emma's relationship with you is determined by court order based on your demonstrated priorities and behavior," Sarah said firmly. "If you want to be part of important events in her life, you need to prove that you can prioritize her welfare consistently, not just when it's convenient for your image." David's expression shifted to the calculated look Sarah had learned to associate with his strategic thinking. "I've been doing a lot of reflection about my mistakes and what I need to change to be a better father. Jessica and I are engaged now, and we're planning to start our own family. I want Emma to be part of that family structure." The casual announcement of his engagement to Jessica, delivered as if it were happy news Sarah should celebrate, was breathtaking in its insensitivity. But even more concerning was David's assumption that Emma would naturally be incorporated into his new family arrangements. "Congratulations on your engagement," Sarah replied with forced politeness. "But Emma's living arrangements and family structure are determined by court order, not your personal plans. I'll be petitioning for modified custody arrangements." David continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. Emma should have the opportunity to be part of a stable two-parent household, and Jessica has demonstrated excellent parenting instincts during our visits. Sarah's blood ran cold at the implication that Jessica had been present during David's supervised visitations with Emma. The court order specifically prohibited introducing Emma to romantic partners without prior approval, and David had apparently been violating that provision. "Jessica has been present during your supervised visits?" Sarah asked, pulling out her phone to document the conversation. David realized his mistake immediately, his expression flickering with annoyance at his own carelessness. "She's been helping me understand how to better connect with Emma. Her experience with children has been invaluable. Your supervised visits are supposed to focus on your relationship with Emma, not on Jessica's involvement in parenting her," Sarah said, already planning to contact Maria about this violation of the court order. David's facade of reasonable co-parent finally cracked, revealing the anger and entitlement that lay beneath his carefully constructed performance. "You can't keep my daughter from me forever," he said, his voice dropping to the threatening tone Sarah remembered from their worst arguments. "I have resources and connections you can't match. Emma deserves better than a bitter mother who's trying to poison her against her father." The threat felt less intimidating than it would have a year earlier, when Sarah had been financially dependent and emotionally devastated. Now, with her own resources and clear evidence of David's continued poor judgment, Sarah felt equipped to handle his intimidation attempts. "Emma deserves a father who prioritizes her welfare over his own convenience," Sarah replied calmly. "Your behavior tonight, including admitting to violating court orders and threatening me on her birthday, proves that you're still not capable of that kind of parenting." David left without further argument, but Sarah knew this confrontation represented escalation rather than resolution. His engagement to Jessica and plans to seek modified custody suggested he was preparing for a new legal battle, confident that his improved personal situation would convince a court to give him more access to Emma. The next morning, Sarah called Maria to report David's violations of the visitation order and his announced intention to seek custody modifications. His admission that Jessica has been present during supervised visits is a serious violation, Maria confirmed. "We can petition the court for contempt charges and use this as evidence that David continues to prioritize his relationship with Jessica over compliance with court orders." More concerning was David's apparent belief that his engagement to Jessica strengthened his custody case. Sarah realized that David's strategic thinking hadn't been diminished by his legal defeats. He'd simply been developing a new approach based on presenting himself as part of a stable, two-parent household. "What are our chances if he does petition for modified custody?" Sarah asked, given his history of deception, violation of court orders, and the circumstances of his relationship with Jessica. "I believe our position remains strong, but David is clearly preparing for another legal battle, and we need to be ready with comprehensive documentation of his continued poor judgment." The private investigator who had previously documented David's affair was retained again to monitor his compliance with visitation orders and gather evidence of any other violations or concerning behavior. What they discovered was disturbing. David had been introducing Emma to Jessica regularly during visits, despite court orders prohibiting such contact. More concerning still, Jessica had been positioning herself as Emma's primary caretaker during these visits, feeding her, changing her diapers, and even referring to herself as Mommy Jessica in front of the court-appointed supervisor. The supervisor's reports revealed a pattern of Jessica attempting to bond with Emma while David remained distracted by phone calls and business concerns. Rather than using visitation time to develop his relationship with his daughter, David was essentially outsourcing parenting responsibilities to his fiancée while violating court orders. This behavior demonstrates exactly why the court was concerned about David's judgment and priorities, Maria explained as they reviewed the supervisor's reports. "He's using visitation time to integrate Jessica into Emma's life, rather than focusing on his own relationship with his daughter." Armed with this evidence, Maria filed contempt charges against David and requested that his visitation be further restricted until he could demonstrate compliance with existing court orders. The motion also requested that any future custody modifications be contingent on David completing extensive parenting classes and psychological evaluation. Judge Morrison's response to David's violations was swift and decisive. At the hearing 3 weeks later, she expressed clear frustration with David's continued disregard for court orders and his prioritization of his romantic relationship over his parental responsibilities. Mr. Mitchell, your repeated violations of this court's orders demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the legal process and a concerning lack of judgment regarding your daughter's welfare. Judge Morrison stated, "Your visitation privileges are hereby suspended pending completion of court-ordered parenting classes and psychological evaluation." The ruling meant that David would have no contact with Emma until he could prove that he was capable of prioritizing her needs over his relationship with Jessica. More significantly, Judge Morrison indicated that any future custody petitions would be viewed skeptically given David's pattern of noncompliance. David's legal team immediately filed appeals and requested emergency hearings, but their arguments were undermined by the clear evidence of his violations and the supervisor's detailed reports about Jessica's inappropriate involvement in his parenting time. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of complete victory in the custody battle. Emma was thriving in their stable home environment, surrounded by people who prioritized her welfare and development. David's threats and manipulation attempts had been neutralized by his own poor judgment and inability to follow court orders. Sarah's consulting business continued to grow, with several major clients signing long-term contracts that would provide financial security well into Emma's school years. The professional success felt especially meaningful because it was built on Sarah's own talents and efforts, rather than depending on anyone else's support or approval. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had once made excuses for David's suspicious behavior and blamed herself for their marital problems had evolved into someone who recognized manipulation tactics immediately and responded with clear boundaries and strategic thinking. Emma's second Christmas was celebrated in their new home, surrounded by friends who had become chosen family and traditions that belonged entirely to them. As Sarah watched her daughter toddle around the Christmas tree, chattering in her developing vocabulary and exploring wrapped presents with infectious excitement, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. The doorbell rang on Christmas morning, interrupting their peaceful celebration. Sarah expected to find a neighbor or delivery person, but instead discovered a well-dressed woman in her 50s holding an envelope and wearing an expression of serious concern. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" the woman asked politely. "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Patricia Chen. Jessica is my daughter. I think we need to talk." Sarah's heart raced as she processed this unexpected development. Jessica's mother had sought her out on Christmas morning, which suggested something urgent and potentially serious. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah asked, curious despite her caution. Patricia entered the living room, glancing around at the comfortable home and Christmas decorations, with what appeared to be approval rather than judgment. "I came to warn you about something," Patricia said directly. "Jessica has been lying to David about her background and her intentions regarding your daughter. I believe you and Emma may be in danger." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "What kind of danger?" "Jessica has a history of targeting successful married men with children, particularly fathers of young daughters. Her previous relationship ended when she tried to gain custody of her boyfriend's 6-year-old daughter through false allegations against the child's mother." Patricia pulled out a thick folder from her purse. "These are court documents from California, where Jessica attempted to have her ex-boyfriend's daughter removed from her mother's custody by claiming the mother was abusive. The allegations were eventually proven false, but not before the family was destroyed by the legal battle." Sarah reviewed the documents with growing horror, recognizing patterns of behavior that Jessica had already demonstrated in her situation with David. The California case showed Jessica systematically isolating a father from his ex-wife, positioning herself as the child's primary female caretaker, and then making false accusations when the mother tried to protect her daughter. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, studying Patricia's face for signs of deception or manipulation. Because I've watched Jessica destroy two families already, and I won't be complicit in her harming a third, Patricia replied, tears forming in her eyes. I love my daughter, but I can't ignore the pattern of her behavior. She specifically targets fathers of young daughters because she believes it's easier to replace the mother figure in a girl's life. The revelation explained Jessica's unusual interest in Emma from the beginning, her immediate positioning of herself as superior to Sarah in parenting capabilities, and her strategic involvement in David's custody battle. Jessica hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been implementing a calculated plan to acquire the family life she wanted by displacing Emma's mother. What should I do with this information? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Protect your daughter, Patricia said simply. Jessica is more dangerous than David realizes, and she's using his guilt and desire for a new family to manipulate him into helping her gain access to Emma. The court orders restricting David's visitation may be the only thing keeping Emma safe right now. Patricia left additional documentation, including psychological evaluations from Jessica's previous relationships and testimonies from other families she had targeted. The evidence painted a picture of a woman with serious psychological issues who specifically sought out fathers with young daughters to fulfill her desire for instant motherhood. Sarah immediately called Maria, despite the Christmas holiday, to discuss this new information and its implications for Emma's safety. This changes everything, Maria said after reviewing Patricia's documents. If Jessica has a pattern of targeting families with young daughters and making false allegations to gain custody, we need to take immediate steps to protect Emma and document this evidence. The most disturbing aspect of Patricia's revelations was the suggestion that Jessica's interest in David had been calculated from the beginning, based on his wealth and the fact that he had a young daughter. The affair hadn't been spontaneous attraction. It had been a strategic selection of a target who could provide both financial security and access to the child Jessica wanted to mother. Over the following weeks, as Sarah processed the full implications of Jessica's psychological profile and history, she realized how much danger Emma had been in during David's violations of the visitation orders. Jessica's attempts to position herself as Mommy Jessica took on sinister meaning when viewed through the lens of her previous attempts to replace other children's mothers. The evidence Patricia had provided also explained David's dramatic personality changes during their marriage. Jessica had been manipulating him psychologically, using sophisticated techniques to isolate him from Sarah and convince him that their marriage was fundamentally flawed. David hadn't just chosen to have an affair. He'd been systematically manipulated by someone with a history of destroying families for her own psychological needs. But rather than feeling sympathy for David, Sarah recognized that his willingness to prioritize his own desires over Emma's welfare had made him vulnerable to Jessica's manipulation. A truly devoted father would have been suspicious of someone who immediately tried to insert herself into his child's life and undermine the child's relationship with her mother. As winter progressed toward spring, Sarah's life settled into a peaceful routine focused on Emma's development and her own professional growth. The consulting business was thriving beyond her expectations, with several major corporations seeking her expertise in marketing strategy and brand development. Emma, now 18 months old, was developing her personality and language skills with remarkable speed. She showed no signs of missing the chaos and tension that had characterized her early months, instead thriving in the stable environment Sarah had created for them. David made several attempts to regain visitation rights, but each petition was denied based on his history of violating court orders and the new evidence about Jessica's psychological profile and history of targeting families. Judge Morrison made it clear that David's relationship with Jessica constituted a risk factor that precluded unsupervised access to Emma. Mr. Mitchell's continued relationship with Ms. Chen, given her documented history of attempting to displace children's mothers, represents a clear danger to Emma's psychological welfare. Judge Morrison ruled during David's final custody petition, until Mr. Mitchell demonstrates the judgment necessary to prioritize his daughter's safety over his romantic relationship. This court cannot authorize increased access. The ruling effectively ended David's legal challenges to the custody arrangement, leaving him with no viable path to regaining access to Emma while maintaining his relationship with Jessica. But Sarah's victory came with an unexpected revelation that would change her understanding of everything that had happened. 6 months after Patricia Chen's Christmas visit, Sarah received a letter that would reframe the entire story of her marriage's destruction. The letter came from Robert Walsh, David's former business partner, who had left the company abruptly 2 years earlier. Sarah remembered David describing Robert's departure as a personal betrayal and business disagreement, but the letter revealed a different story entirely. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I feel compelled to tell you the truth about what happened to your marriage and why I really left David's company. Jessica Chen was not a random business associate who developed feelings for your husband. She was hired by my current company to gather intelligence about David's business practices and client relationships. Her affair with David was part of a corporate espionage operation designed to gain access to proprietary information and client lists." Sarah read the letter twice before the implications fully sank in. Jessica's involvement with David hadn't been motivated by love or even her psychological need to acquire family. It had been a professional assignment designed to destroy David's business by gaining access to confidential information. The letter continued, "I discovered the corporate espionage when I found encrypted files on Jessica's computer during a routine IT security check. When I confronted David about Jessica's true role, he refused to believe me and accused me of being jealous of his success. I left the company because I couldn't be complicit in the industrial sabotage. But I've been watching from a distance as Jessica destroyed your family while gathering the information needed to steal David's clients and intellectual property." Robert's letter included documentation showing that Jessica's hiring had been arranged by Meridian Industries, a competing tech firm that had been trying to acquire David's client base and proprietary software for years. The affair and subsequent destruction of David's marriage had been collateral damage in a corporate war that David had been too blinded by infatuation to recognize. Jessica's pattern of targeting families with children wasn't random psychological compulsion. Robert's letter explained, "It was a cover story designed to explain her interest in David and provide access to your home and his personal life. The children were never the primary target. The business intelligence was, but Jessica's psychological evaluation suggests she genuinely developed an obsession with replacing mothers, making her both a corporate spy and a genuine psychological threat to your family." The revelation reframed everything Sarah thought she understood about the betrayal. David hadn't just chosen his mistress over his family. He'd been manipulated by a professional operative trained to exploit his weaknesses and blind spots. Jessica's success in destroying their marriage had been the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation, combined with corporate resources and strategic planning. But even more disturbing was the implication that Emma had been in danger, not just from Jessica's psychological obsession with motherhood, but from her professional need to maintain cover for her espionage activities. A stable relationship with David required controlling potential threats to her operation, including Sarah's interference and Emma's connection to her father. Sarah called Maria immediately to discuss the implications of Robert's revelations and determine whether this information changed their legal strategy or safety concerns. This explains Jessica's sophisticated manipulation techniques and her access to resources that seem beyond her apparent means. Maria observed, "Corporate espionage operations often include psychological profiling and manipulation training. Jessica wasn't just a disturbed woman with mother fantasies. She was a trained operative using those fantasies as cover for her real mission." The realization that Emma's safety had been threatened by corporate espionage rather than just psychological dysfunction was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because Jessica's primary interest had been business intelligence rather than harming Emma, but terrifying because corporate operatives were trained to eliminate threats to their missions by any means necessary. "What should we do with this information?" Sarah asked. "Document everything and report it to both the FBI and corporate security divisions of the companies involved." Maria advised, "Corporate espionage is a federal crime. And if Robert's documentation proves Jessica was engaged in industrial sabotage, she'll face criminal charges that will end her threat to your family permanently. The FBI investigation that followed Robert's revelations uncovered a sophisticated corporate espionage network that had been operating for years, targeting successful tech entrepreneurs and using romantic manipulation to gain access to proprietary information. Jessica was arrested along with several associates, and Meridian Industries faced federal charges for industrial sabotage. David's reaction to learning about Jessica's true identity and mission was devastating to witness, even for Sarah, who no longer loved him. The man who had sacrificed his family for what he believed was genuine love discovered that he'd been professionally manipulated by someone who viewed him as nothing more than a mark in a corporate intelligence operation. "I destroyed everything for someone who was using me," David said during one of the few conversations he and Sarah had after Jessica's arrest. "My marriage, my relationship with Emma, my business reputation, all for someone who never cared about me at all." Sarah felt sympathy for David's pain while maintaining clear boundaries about their relationship and Emma's welfare. "You made choices based on what you believed at the time," she said. "But those choices had consequences that can't be undone just because we now understand Jessica's motivation." With Jessica facing federal charges and likely imprisonment, the threat to Emma's safety was eliminated, but David's access to his daughter remained restricted based on his demonstrated poor judgment and history of violating court orders. As Emma approached her second birthday, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a naive wife making excuses for her husband's suspicious behavior into an independent mother and successful businesswoman who had survived corporate espionage, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and a complex legal battle. The consulting firm had grown to include 5 employees and was being courted by major corporations seeking Sarah's expertise in crisis management and strategic communication. The skills she'd developed navigating her personal crisis had proven valuable in helping other businesses manage complex challenges and reputation threats. Emma was thriving in their stable home environment, developing into a confident, curious toddler who showed no signs of the trauma that had characterized her early months. She was surrounded by chosen family who prioritized her welfare and development, creating the foundation for a healthy, happy childhood, despite the unusual circumstances of her parents' separation. On the evening before Emma's second birthday party, Sarah sat in the nursery watching her daughter sleep peacefully in her crib. The room was decorated with butterflies and flowers, symbols of transformation and growth that felt appropriate for their journey together. As she prepared to leave the nursery, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your victory, but this isn't over. David was just the beginning. Some of us believe Emma deserves to know her father's family, regardless of court orders. Sweet dreams." Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the message, recognizing it as a threat despite its seemingly polite tone. Jessica was in federal prison, but someone connected to her or David's situation was apparently continuing the campaign to gain access to Emma. She immediately called Maria and reported the threatening message, beginning a new phase of vigilance and protection that would require all the strength and resources Sarah had developed during her journey from victim to victor. The message served as a reminder that victory in one battle didn't guarantee permanent safety, and that protecting Emma would require continued vigilance and strength. But Sarah no longer felt like the naive woman who had once made excuses for obvious deception. She was a mother, a successful businesswoman, and a survivor who had overcome sophisticated manipulation and corporate espionage to build a safe, stable life for her daughter. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah was prepared to face them with the wisdom and resources she'd gained through adversity. The phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes of her destroyed marriage, stronger and more determined than ever to protect the life she'd built from the ruins of betrayal and deception. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Sarah gently adjusted her daughter's blanket before turning on the baby monitor and leaving the room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe, surrounded by love and protected by the strength Sarah had discovered within herself. The story of betrayal and redemption was far from over, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer the vulnerable woman who had once trusted too easily and doubted her own perceptions. She was a force to be reckoned with, and anyone who threatened her daughter's safety would discover exactly how fierce a mother's protection could be.